Well, moving forward with statistics, this in 8.3 we're looking at measures of central tendency, and this tends to be the main area of statistics that students are most familiar with because even as early as like pre-algebra, they introduce some of these basic measures of central tendency like a mean, a median, and a mode. Those can kind of spill into some pretty early math. So a lot of this will be a review, but I get to show you some good things on a calculator too. So if you have your calculator handy, you might want to do a couple things with me when I get to those here in just a minute. So, obviously statistics are used in like everywhere. So they're used in business, they're used in sports, they're used in everything that we do. So this is definitely one of the more relevant areas of math that we can apply to some real life scenarios. So these are just some basic ideas of just some averages and basic things that they discuss. But let me go. One thing I want to point out to you in this first part is this one right here. When you see reference to the 50th percentile, the 50th percentile would be referring to the middle percent or the middle item. So we always link the 50th percentile to the median. The median is the middle term. So that's a big one. You might want to make note of that. This is something that will come up again down the road, but as soon as you see 50th percentile, you got to link that to the median. So moving forward, just a couple reminders. Mean is an average. So for an average, simply where you add up all the terms, divide it by the number of terms, and you get your average. The median is the middle term. In order to identify that, you would have to put all your values in order from least to greatest to identify the middle term. If you ever get a case where there's no true middle because you have an even number of terms, you simply find the average of the two middle terms. So if you had numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, there's no clear middle term on that, so I would take the average of the middle two, which would be 2 and 3, and so my median would be 2.5. The mode is most. It's what you have the most of. So there can be cases where you have no mode. For example, if you had a list of data where all the data were different, right, then there would be no mode. There would be not any number that is repeated more often than any other number, so you can have no mode. If that ever happens, don't say your mode is 0. 0 is a specific number, so you'd have to say no mode. Otherwise, you're going to see some number that gets repeated more often than other numbers, and so you can have a mode. You can have more than one mode. You can have 2 modes, 3 modes. There's no clear-cut rule on how many modes you can have. So typically, you're not put into a situation where you have to make that discernment. You'll see kind of obvious what would be the mode. So using some real data right here. First things first, if we were to calculate the average or the mean by hand, we would add up all the terms, divide by 5 because there are 5 terms, and that's how we'd get the mean. This can be done in a calculator, and I'm going to show you that right now, but I want you to keep in mind, you're going to see this in the last couple examples. It is important that you know how to use these kind of formula or algebraic way of doing some of these because they can give you cases where you can't do it in the calculator and you need to know how to do it by hand, and so you have to have an understanding of how that would be done. But obviously if the situation calls for it and we can do it in a calculator, we might as well take advantage of that. So if you have your calculator handy, let me show you how to do this. So I'm going to take this list of data right here, so keep this list in mind or in front of you, but I'm going to be working with those 5 values. So if I go to my calculator here, most of what we would be doing for this area is going to be under the stat button. So if I hit stat, this is what comes up first. To create a list of data, you just go under edit. So I'm going to hit enter, and here's all my lists. So I've already put those 5 numbers into list 1, and so those are going to stay there. Quick FYI, if you're ever going to clear out an old list of data, all you have to do is go up to the very top, highlight the list, hit clear, and then hit enter, and that will clear the list. What you don't want to do is hit delete, because it will delete that entire column from your calculator, and you have to reset your whole calculator in order to get it back, which you can do, but it's a little bit of a hassle. Anyway, now that I have my list of data in there, if I go back into Stat and I go under Calc, we only have one variable here. It's just one list of data. So I'm going to choose my one variable statistics right there at the top, and I'm going to hit Enter. Yes, I did put my data into list 1. We did not have a frequency list, so I got to leave that empty. And I'm going to hit Enter. And I get all the information I would need here. So if you look up at the very top, that's your mean, is 32. For the mean, you can either use the X with the bar on top. There are a lot of statistics uses that notation. You can also use the Greek letter mu, which looks like a U, and that's used as the mean as well. So both of those refer to the mean. You can, let's see, we got standard deviation. The 12.05 is your standard deviation. We can see the number of terms. There were 5 terms. The minimum term was 25. I have my first quartile. So you get all kinds of data here. There's your median. So our median was at the bottom of the screen is 26. I get my third quartile. I get the max. So if they were to ask me about the range, I would do 56 minus 25 to get my range. When they ask me for the interquartile range, that's going to be Q3 minus Q1. So that's my interquartile range. So we get all this data on this one page. The one thing you won't find on there is the mode. And so the mode is something you have to be able to interpret by looking at the data, but that's kind of like the easiest one to identify. So you don't really need a calculator for that. Anyway, this is what I just did in the calculator. So those were the commands that we used. Again, here's your mean right here. So again, these are the 2 different forms of a mean. So they use the mu when they're referring to the population. They use the X with the bar when they're referring to the sample. In most cases, it doesn't really matter. As long as you understand that this is a mean and this is a mean, then we're good. So some of these first items here I already dealt with up above, so we already kind of said what that was. So for the mode, again, here's a case where you would have no mode, right? Those are all equal frequencies, so no mode on that. You could have 2 modes. So this one has a mode of, right, there's a frequency of 2 for this value. There's a frequency of 2 for this value, so we'd have to state both of these as our mode. If I had 3 of those but only 2 of those, this would be my only mode. Moving down, we saw in the first video that oftentimes data is not listed out into one big long list. We group it into a frequency table. So instead of listing out 7 of these, we'd rather just say, hey, I had 7 3s. And so that's just an easier way of shrinking down the data within a reasonable table like this one. This can also be done in your calculator. So I'm going to do that right now. So again, I'm going to have to come back to this, but I'll just kind of show you where I'm going. So I'm going to pause this. I'm going to put this into my calculator, and then I'll come back and show you how I did it. All right, so if you go to your calculator, again, go back into your lists. You saw in that table that there was the list of data was list 1. Those were the X values. Those were the variables. List 2 were the frequencies. That's just how many of those responses you had. Please note that this is not 2 variable statistics. There's only one variable here. We simply stated in this column how many of those variables we had. I had 1 0, I had 2 1s, I had 6 2s, and so on. But now that I've created the list, again, if I go into Stats, go under Calc, I'm still in one variable statistics. The only difference is now I have a frequency list. So I have to identify column 2 as my frequency list. So right above the number 2, you're going to see L2. So I'm going to hit second 2 to identify that list 2 was my frequency list. And now when I calculate my responses, it's the same page of information, but now it took into account that I had a frequency list. And that would change your answers. If you don't include the frequency list, you're going to get different numbers. But all that same data is here with including a frequency list. So anyway, so certain things, of course, you could do these by hand, but you'd really rather not if you don't have to, and in most cases you don't. I'm going to show you some examples at the bottom of these notes of things you would need to do by hand. I'm not going to do all this in my calculator because it's the same thing as what I just did up above. All I want to point out on this is if you have classes, so like I have 9 responses that were somewhere within this class, but I don't know what those 9 responses were. They could all have been 201. I could have had 5 responses that were 200 and the other 4 responses were 208. We have no way of knowing. All I know is that these 9 responses were somewhere within that range. So what we have to do on this, if I'm going to put this in my calculator, is use what we call the mid-interval values. We're just going to assume that those 9 responses were the midpoint of that range. So I'm going to just find the middle number. So if I did 200 plus 209 divided by 2, I get the mid-interval, or the average of 200 and 209. I get the mid-interval, and that's what I would put in my calculator for list 1. So that's what you're seeing going right on here in the math. So under list 1, I would start with 204.5, and I would continue on down with all the mid-intervals as list 1. My frequencies would be list 2, so on and so on. And so that's the way you would do it in the calculator, and then it would go just like the one I just did on the previous example. Keep in mind that from a frequency table, you can identify things like a mode. I can see here that the highest frequency was 52, so this class is my mode. So my mode is from 270 to 279. All right, moving down, so here's 2 cases where you need to know the math. You can't really do these on just a calculator. So in this case, I know I have 20 numbers. I know the mean, and what they're asking is what if I threw in another number and the mean became 4, what would that number be? Well, here was the original setup. If I added up all my data, or the sum of my x's, all added together, divided by the number of terms, that was my mean. Well, here's how you would adjust that based on the given information here. Notice I no longer have 20 terms. If I add in another number, I'm now up to 21. If I multiply this 20 over to here, then I can see that the sum of my x's was 62. So I have the original sum plus whatever new number I'm adding in. And we don't know what that is, but it's some number that I'm adding in over 21 terms. I know the new mean is 4, and now I can just solve that equation for n to get the item that was added in. And then last example here, again, just being able to interpret the given information. So I have this list of data. It's not in order. All I know is that A is less than B. I know the mode is 7 and the mean is 9, and I'm supposed to use that to figure out my answer here. And so for A and B, the mean is the one formula we have. We don't really have a formula for mode, so I'm going to work with the mean formula where you add up all your terms. So we're going to add up all those terms. So what you're seeing right here, the sum of my x's divided by the number of terms is the mean. And so that's the way we would set this up. This piece of information was simply given so that I know that at least one of these has to be a 7. If my mode is 7, then I would need another 7 in my list in order to have a mode of 7. So one of those guys is a 7. We don't know which one, but so we're going to identify one of those as 7. This is the other value, but now I could solve for x. And if I come out with x, on that I get 13. Based on this statement right here, I know that A would be the 7 and B is the 13.